Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics Football. It's Fran here, and I'm back with a Game Week 10 preview and cheat sheet. Now, of course, this week was quite a monumental week in the sense that, we had some very kind of big unexpected results in the sense that we had Liverpool 5-0 versus United and a couple other fixtures where I think, probably the kind of premiums that we expected to do reasonably well this week didn't really deliver. And of course, a big punt, of course, for a lot of people in terms of FPL Twitter and kind of social media circles as well was someone like Havertz, who didn't actually end up getting a haul. And I think a lot of people kind of ended up being very dismayed unless they actually ended up having a Salah captaincy and Trent kind of haul as well. So I think this week what has really kind of shown is that in terms of the premiums, with exception to maybe Son, who arguably has good fixtures, post game week 10, and someone like Kane as well, who also follows in the same kind of vein because he plays for Tottenham as well. It just really shows that a lot of the premiums are in and around the league aren't very interesting whatsoever, right? So we have players like Bruno, Mane, and KDB who just haven't really been that interesting due to rotation, also how poor some of their teams have been playing. That's of course true for Bruno. And then in terms of, let's say, looking at Lukaku, he's still injured. With Kane, for example, similar kind of situation where I don't think he's really stepped into the best of his form, nor have Spurs themselves. To be quite honest, when we were looking at how interesting Son was, it was actually in spite of how poor Spurs had been playing, and the same really goes with Ronaldo in terms of the same logic as Fernandes. Now, if we go back to, let's say, the defenders this week, I actually think there was actually a considerable amount of movement in terms of defenders because I think we also finally saw a week where Duffy lost his starting position in the team. And if I actually just quickly update that there, Duffy is 4.3. Duffy actually being dropped this week was quite interesting. And I think, maybe I don't think he's necessarily lost his starting spot in the team on a permanent basis. But I think it did show that, for example, Graham Potter's general style in terms of how he wants to play is to play out of the back. And perhaps he actually saw this as an opportunity to maybe have another player who he didn't necessarily need in terms of an aerial threat, right? Versus Man City, especially who is, I would considerably say, a shorter team than most. And a more ball dominant team for sure. I think we saw, especially in the second half, the impact of someone else in this actual cheat sheet, who's Lamptey. Now, I brought Lamptey into this cheat sheet, but he clearly should still be in that kind of differential / avoid for now category. But what I would think as the reason why Duffy has fallen this week is that I can see a capacity for Brighton to move into a structure where Lamptey will finally find that kind of starting spot in the lineup that he did in the previous year. And Lamptey, of course, was one of the more interesting kind of stalwart young defenders, right wing backs in the league that was super interesting, and I think he contributes a lot to the attacking play of Brighton. And when Brighton have their fixtures eased up, after the Liverpool game as a good example, Brighton could be a very, very interesting team to have. And especially if you're someone who doesn't own, for example, someone like Sanchez as a keeper, Lamptey makes a lot of sense in your teams, as long as he finally gets some starts. So far, I think he's only had kind of second half kind of minutes in terms of 30 to 4 minutes a game. But once he actually becomes a star on that team, I think Lamptey becomes a very interesting pick, and he'll definitely surge up these kind of cheat sheet rankings. In terms of the movement in the 4.9 to 5.1 territory, there's been a huge kind of amassing of falls. And I think the large reason behind this is just simply due to the fact that I think we've clearly found a separation from the pack in terms of assets who are kind of worth, 4.0 to 4.4 mil, and then there being a huge difference between those assets in that kind of mid-range at 4.9 to 5.1, who just aren't overall that interesting, right? When we compare them to the assets that are 5.4 and above, or 5.5 and above, really, in the case of those kind of Man City assets, like the cheaper ones, Laporte and Walker, or even someone like Reece James and Chilwell, who have dropped in recent times, including Rudiger. I think it just shows that there's a huge gulf just because of how, impressive the Chelsea and City defense have been lately. Yes, I think, of course, we expect them to lose their clean sheets from time to time, but we know that when the fixtures are decent, or even just in general, I think there's a capacity for them to keep in clean sheets even versus top teams. And that for me it shows why there's such a big difference. I mean, you can see a player like Matip as well dropping this week, for that very reason. Matip didn't get to play versus Man United. Konate actually got a start and looked very, very impressive, to be honest. Meanwhile, when we look at a player like Tierney, he's of course just an injury doubt right now, and you should definitely avoid. And you have, of course, the option to get a cheaper player in terms of Ben White and Tomiyasu. And then with cash and target, I would have to say that Aston Villa's performances lately have just been a little bit up and down, and it's just not worth it to actually hold that kind of money in terms of a player who probably doesn't contribute that much in terms of attack, and I have to fall them into a differential category. Not only that, but I think if you're looking for, let's say, an Aston Villa defender, I mean, arguably, we'd be looking at a keeper like Martinez, right, who actually gets in a lot of saves and actually gets additional points, even if they don't get to keep a clean sheet or he doesn't get to keep a clean sheet. When we look at the 5.4 to 5.7 territory, I have to say that Cresswell has to hit a rise this week. I think Cresswell is super interesting because he was that kind of player where we saw in terms of the stats, he probably actually was not as interesting in terms of open play when Soufal is on the pitch. And I think, however, he's still kind of ranked very highly in terms of fullbacks who are actually contributing a lot in open play. And I think what the last 2 weeks have shown is that West Ham are actually quite defensively resilient. And I think they've actually improved markedly upon the arrival of Zuma. And that's super interesting as someone who could maybe look at Cresswell in the very future. I think he's even more interesting than Shaw right now, and that's why he's above Shaw, right? I think United have shown to be a very, very poor defensive side as of late. Yes, West Ham are about to enter a very poor fixture swing, but that's exactly why Cresswell is a differential. I think in the recent weeks we saw him get a kind of set piece assist and also the 3 bonus points today versus Tottenham. And what it really shows as well, I think, when you actually look at the core of the West Ham team, there's a lot of options there and a lot of assets there who can actually get a haul from a corner. We saw Bowen, for example, get assists from corners lately, and Cresswell is kind of there to be an option who can actually do that for you. And you have Souček, Antonio, and several other players who can contribute to scoring off a corner. That's it for the defenders. And right now, I'd also like to shout out OneFootball. OneFootball are a fantastic football fan app that can be used for pretty much any football means. If you're a football fan who actually wants to check out the latest results and you're actually away from your home, for example, not watching a specific match, you can actually use it to catch up with all the latest results all in one place, following multiple leagues around the world. 160 plus leagues are covered, including European leagues and also international fixtures. You can also use it as a nice way to actually collate your news all into one place and make kind of set little filters for your favorite team, your favorite leagues, and any kind of preferences that you actually want. And you can make sure that all your kind of interests are catered into one place, and that's pretty much the whole point of the app. You can actually use it to track what managers are, for example, saying about your players, check out the latest injury news, and also kind of look into some editorial insights into maybe match previews and things like that. So please check out the app in the link in the description below. It actually works for both iPhone and Android users. But going back into the cheat sheet, we'll look at the midfielders next, right? And I think in the midfielder category, we actually have had a considerable amount of movement once again. And I think it shows that we are slightly heading into a phase where a lot of those kind of assets, in that range between, 5.5 to 6.7, arguably have not been as interesting as we initially thought. And it also comes down to fixture swings, so those kind of affecting someone like Sar, who was very interesting in previous weeks. But if we look at the 5.4 assets, I think the one who has clearly risen this week and is the only one who has risen is Smith Rowe. Yes, of course, this is off the back of a very good haul, and we have to consider that Arsenal are going to have kind of worse fixtures in the future. But I have to say that I think Smith Rowe has made a step up in terms of how he's contributed to Arsenal as of late. And I think when you actually look at the statistics, he ranks very highly in terms of very good, favorable FPL statistics in terms of carries into the box, which is of course the area where you want your midfielder to be attacking in. And not only that, but just I think he's shown a little bit more incisiveness in terms of actually getting into the box and actually getting into a shooting area and being there, to actually get off the back of a play and, as opposed to just carrying the ball and actually laying it off to someone else, which was something that he did a little bit better last season in terms of, recognizing that he was someone who carried the ball very well, was very good at 1-2s, but would not necessarily have the end product that we've seen, I think, in this season. I think he's had a market improvement in that kind of area. And as a young talent, I think that's the kind of catalyst that you're looking for, right, to actually pick up an asset. And I've been really kind of pleasantly surprised by Smith Rowe's kind of continual improvement as a player. And that makes him rise this week. In terms of Mbeumo, he's someone who actually still sits in that kind of best position this week. I think, of course, with the very early substitution, it has to hurt for an Mbeumo owner. But what I have to say is that, the fixtures are just really there. And what we've seen lately from teams who are playing Burnley, Norwich, and the like is that, ultimately you can find your fixture or your form rather in these fixtures where you're going to get the spaces, you're going to get the chances. And for example, if you look at someone like Hudson-Odoi, who was able to exploit the spaces versus Norwich as an example, he was able to do that. I think Mbeumo is a very similar kind of player in that kind of mold where he's a very fast, dynamic player and he can get on to the end of the balls that he will usually be supplied with Brentford, right? And that kind of space that these weaker teams will provide are probably enough for him to actually make up for, I guess, his lack of clinical finishing. And that still makes him quite an interesting asset at that kind of price and due to the fact that he's out of position. I've had to add Kovacic this week simply due to the fact that I think he's had wonderful hauls, to be quite honest. Yes, of course, this is a box-to-box player. It's not someone you should naturally really have in your team, right? And I think a lot of his hauls have really come from individual games, and he's kind of gone quiet in others. And that makes him extremely hard to pick on a week-to-week basis. But I still think, Chelsea have some nice fixtures in the near future. If for some reason you're maybe going a wild card and you wanted to fit in a Chelsea player that you couldn't in the past, maybe you could consider Kovacic. He's still a differential at the same time, and just for me, not that interesting. He's a box-to-box player, and we can pretty much leave it at that, right? With Townsend, I think the only reason why he falls is because I think with DCL and Richarlison coming back to fitness, and especially Richarlison having another kind of haul, I think we can clearly see him play a much more supportive role in the future. He will also probably get taken off that kind of totem pole in terms of the penalties, right? While DCL is still out. And at least if we're to trust, Rafa's previous comments, and for that reason, I think he falls on this list. Otherwise, of course, we're looking at one of the previous top point earners on a kind of points per match basis in the season. But I think that the Everton fixtures are also going to considerably go worse. And when you're comparing to someone like Gray, I think Gray is someone who's much more dynamic and can actually deliver. Even in the tougher fixtures, in my honest opinion. I think you can look at games like, for example, the United game where he was actually able to carry the ball into an isolated area, where then Doucouré and Townsend were able to capitalize on that to actually look at a signal for why Gray is quite interesting as an asset. Like, I think he can still beat a lot of elite defenders because of how dynamic he is as a player, whereas I think Townsend a little bit less so. And that's pretty much why I still see there's a difference, even though Townsend has been the more consistent point earner. In terms of the 5.9 to 6.7 territory, I've collapsed it so that actually Rafinha actually falls within this band. Of course, it's a huge kind of blow and a dampener, at least for me as a Rafinha owner, to have lost him this week to injury. And I'm not exactly sure of the injury timeline. We have to kind of wait for the midweek kind of updates in terms of press conferences from Bielsa, who is always usually very forthright with his answers, and we can rely on that in the future to kind of get a gauge of how well Rafinha will do. But I think if Rafinha can come back at least after the Norwich game, he's the one I'm looking for to keep for the long term in my team. So I have no real issues. And on top of that, I think the 3-4-3 structure is probably the most dynamic in the game right now. And on top of that, I think Rafinha is someone who, for me, is arguably fixture proof. Of course, at the start of the season, owning Benrahma over Rafinha was a huge point boost for me. But I think Rafinha is that kind of player that is exceptional, and I think I have to keep him in that kind of territory. In terms of Benrahma and Bowen, I have to drop them. I have to say that I think in terms of open play, we've definitely seen a lot less chances being built up over the last few maybe 4 or 5 games from West Ham. And of course, even though Bowen has had better form than Benrahma in the recent ones, I would say that Benrahma has still overall looked very good on the ball. And even though I think he's about to hit a price fall today or tonight, I'm still looking to keep him on my team and maybe transfer him later on the week. I just don't really know, or at least I'd rather be safer in terms of managing the money in my team and not have to deal with midweek kind of injuries in terms of ties before I move on from Benrahma myself. But to be quite honest, I think this is the time to move away from Benrahma. Yes, there's still a lovely Aston Villa game, but Aston Villa are at least playing at home. And that for me is just the general worry. I think Benrahma's form has gone slightly worse. I think West Ham's overall effectiveness in terms of creating that many chances at open play has diminished slightly. And for that reason, I think it makes sense to drop both of them at the same time, even though Bowen has been arguably more fixture or more in form. I think it just comes down to the lack of chances that these two are creating. And not only that, but I think in a week where especially Antonio managed to score a goal, I think you can look at the catalyst for the goal. It was really just a set piece, right? It doesn't really show that West Ham have what it takes to be a team worth kind of investing or doubling up on their attack for. And that's pretty much how I see things. In terms of Saka, I think he has to fall. I think once again, it kind of speaks to how in this kind of area, I think some of the assets actually who are cheaper, who are enablers, are more interesting, right? Because it means that you probably have the ability to maybe shore up your kind of rotation in terms of the team. So a lot of people who are looking, for example, to go into players like Jota or Foden, who could arguably be rotation proof from a game-to-game basis, could probably fall back on having enablers in their bench. And Saka's kind of at that mid-range where with Benrahma, he does occupy and you want him to play 90 minutes, but when he plays 90 minutes, he might not necessarily deliver. And that's kind of what we've had from recent Saka performances, even though he had an exceptional game versus Spurs. I think overall that speaks as well to Arsenal, where I think unfortunately, a lot of the hauls are mixed all over the team, and you're not going to capitalize week to week the right Arsenal player. I think a lot of people, for example, have put Smith Rowe on the bench, and I think you could fall to that kind of similar mistake with having Saka on your team. I just think it makes more sense, for example, if you're looking at an Arsenal asset, probably to look at Smith Rowe just because he's that much cheaper, and then with Saka, probably consider someone else at a higher kind of price range at this point in time. The same kind of goes with Sarr. I think he clearly was a talismanic player under the previous manager, but I think I'm a little bit concerned with, of course, that kind of early substitution in the Everton game. We saw Everton kind of collapse versus Watford immediately after Saka was subbed, ironically, and Saka didn't manage to get any kind of goals. This is in a game where Watford managed to bag 5, and that was a little bit of a worry. And overall, I think that shows that maybe Ranieri is looking for something different at this moment in time. I'm not exactly sure what that is. I have to watch a little bit more of Watford, but I think that was a telltale sign, especially with such an early substitution, to say that Sarr probably doesn't belong anywhere than just being a differential. I've added Tielemans to the list once again, another kind of midfielder player who's not really going to get into the box very often. In fact, all his kind of contributions this season have been outside of the box. So overall, I think he's just clearly differential. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to get him. I've just added him here. Sorry. For completeness reasons. Oops, and I think Greenwood unfortunately has been put into the wrong place. Greenwood is clearly within the higher kind of category. But as we can see here in terms of Greenwood, right next to him, I think Greenwood has clearly fallen, whereas someone like Jota and Mount have risen. So Greenwood for me, apologies for editing the video on the fly. But yeah, someone like Greenwood, for example, hasn't been that interesting lately, just due to the fact that United have been so poor. And I think the substitution with him as well shows that I think Ole might be in a mix in terms of how to kind of tactically set up his team. I think he tried to substitute Pogba on probably to kind of shore up the midfield because they were losing a lot of balance with that kind of double pivot, and Greenwood wasn't really contributing much on defense. And I think moving forwards, maybe if United are trying to instill maybe a 3 midfield structure, then I think Greenwood might have less games as well. We also know that Sancho might be coming off the bench, and I think just the fixtures as well aren't fantastic for United, and I don't expect much more. In terms of Jota, I have to say that when we're always looking at Jota, I think, yes, the big open goal miss versus Crystal Palace is going to haunt a lot of people in their minds. And of course, people seem to have actually bought Jota for that period, whereas they've dropped him, just like I have, for example, this week, where he managed a fantastic haul versus United. And yes, whilst that's a little bit unlucky, I have to say that overall, I think Jota still makes a lot of sense as an asset. He does lead the league in a lot of good categories, such as expected goals per 90 minutes, and I think simply put, the stats make him a very, very favorable asset, even if he doesn't play on a game-to-game basis. As long as I think you have some sort of coverage on him, or he even gets to play 30-40 minutes of football each week, I think Jota is fantastic on his price point, even if Liverpool have arguably kind of middling fixtures, right? I think we have to also say that Liverpool are markedly a step above most of the teams in the league, and the toughest fixtures in terms of Chelsea and City for the first half of the season are already gone. So even though, yes, you look at the rest of the fixture schedule for Liverpool, it still makes a lot of sense to have Jota in your team. And I think I can even see myself moving out of Mount, for example, to go into Jota in the near future, if I am to go for Mount as an example. With Mount, I have to say that he has to rise. I mean, yes, he was clearly out of form, I think, before the Norwich game, but we still have 2 very, very simple, arguably, games to go, right? Where I think Chelsea can create a lot of chances, and Mount can be a pivotal part of that. And for me, when I'm looking at Mount as an asset too, he actually leads Chelsea in both expected goals per 90 and expected assists per 90. Now, a little bit, of course, of that is inflated by the Norwich game, but arguably all Chelsea players have had their stats inflated by the Norwich game. And the fact that Mount still stands at the top there, when this list includes players like Werner and Lukaku, I think is a very healthy sign to say that Mount makes a lot of sense for the next 2 weeks, as a Chelsea asset. And perhaps we could even find a structure where maybe Lukaku doesn't fit in necessarily very well, and we'll see that Mount maybe gets a little bit more game time, because of course we've seen that he was actually rotatable in recent memory. So that is the only kind of slight concern with Mount, but I think in these 2 next fixtures, he's going to play a very, very critical part, and I would be happy to have in my team. In terms of Bernardo Silva, he's someone who I've actually included into this list for this week. I just think that, yes, Bernardo Silva is once again another midfielder, but I have to say that some of the midfielders on this list are kind of here maybe in a sense due to very inconsistent returns, or at least returns that we would say are maybe due to very specific conditions. For example, Kovacic in a game versus Norwich, where Norwich were giving a lot of space towards Chelsea, not pressing intensely enough, and then maybe Tielemans as well scoring these kind of beautiful long shots. Whereas someone like Bernardo Silva for me is a little bit different in the sense that I think he contributes so much to attacking play in open play as well, and he can really slice apart some of the best teams in the league. I think we saw that actually in the Liverpool game, where he actually managed to dribble around 3 to 4 people and actually still thread a beautiful pass to Foden, who I think was unable to capitalize on that. But we've seen assists and goals from a game-to-game basis, not huge hauls, but he can be someone who at the 7.0 price can give you very consistent hauls, and I think that makes him super interesting as an option. I won't say too much more on that because I think for me it's still a little bit more interesting to have an option like Foden, even though he's obviously a little bit more rotatable. But that's how I see things with Bernard. I think he can be an actual very interesting option for the midfield in the future. In terms of someone like Foden, I had to rise him this week because, yes, he was someone who I had in my team, so there's a little bit of personal bias there. But I think if you've been watching him lately, I think he's clearly the one who's very, very hungry in the team, contributing a lot to defense, which is something that actually Pep likes in terms of actually, keeping the structure of the team and actually keeping the pressing intensity. And Foden is someone who really just finds a way to get onto the end of the balls because he is so quick and so dynamic as a player, but also constantly looking to reposition himself to make sure that he stays on side at times and also can actually capitalize on very, very critical counterattacks. I think when you look at how many chances have been created for him and him specifically, you have to say that he makes a lot of sense as an asset. And of course, it kind of leads into this discussion between Foden and Grealish, which was kind of the talking point when people were making their wild cards maybe 2 weeks ago. And I think, from my point of view, I think Grealish was still a very good asset, and I think I've had to re-rise him this week because I think he's a little bit more nailed than someone like Mahrez, and that's what interests me about Grealish. I think he can get those kind of additional points, whether it's clean sheet points, a little bit of bonus points as well in a good game, and I still think he's destined for, eventually like a very, very, a little bit more explosive of a haul in terms of maybe 1 goal, 1 assist, because for me the numbers are there for Grealish as well. Not as interesting as Foden in terms of, I think, as an FPL asset, but definitely someone who can be a little bit more consistent, I would say, and less explosive. In terms of premiums, I've already discussed this from the outset of the video. It's a very, very tough time in terms of having a second premium in your team, and actually some managers might be finding it weird to actually spend the kind of Ronaldo / Lukaku / Kane money correctly, or even Vardy money, right? Because the midfield options just aren't that interesting, with the exception to Son. So I think when we're looking at Bruno, we're looking at someone who's playing for a team that's clearly very out of form. He was also subbed off quite early in the the Liverpool game, which is quite a shock, I think, as well, to see Bruno getting subbed off so early. In terms of Mane, him being rotated, I think, was also, I think, equally as much of a shock. I don't think we expect Mane to be dropped too often. We usually expect some sort of rotation between Jota and Firmino. But I think, the fact that Jota, Firmino, and Mane are always at very good form, and Salah is someone who is clearly undroppable out of the kind of 4, just shows that, everyone in the Liverpool side is susceptible to rotation, and that makes Mane clearly a differential at that kind of elite price that he's at. In terms of the forward, though, I actually think there's been, once again, a lot of movement this week. I think with Hwang, what we're seeing is that he, as I said, was someone who I really kind of capitalized, on my wildcard 8 and 7 drafts for a lot of you guys who are still kind of waiting to use a wildcard. And the reason why is because for me, he looked like a very clinical poacher, a very classic kind of striker option. Even though he doesn't really necessarily play as an out-and-out striker, he does find himself in those positions, and he's a bit more dynamic, of course, than classic strikers because he's very, very fast as a player. And for me, that kind of clinical finishing is what you want from a Wolves side who aren't actually developing too many chances. But Hwang being so clinical makes him a very, very interesting option. I think Broja, if I'm mispronouncing his name, please feel free to correct me. Is a young kind of promising Albanian talent that I really spotted maybe 3-4 weeks ago. I think when he hit the post versus Man City, I believe, or another game. But I think for me, I was always very critical of how interesting Armstrong was as an asset, and that was just due to the eye test. Broja was someone who kind of struck out to me, and also was someone who was performing well, on an international level too. And the fact that he's actually hauled on a week-to-week, on a back-to-back kind of basis for Southampton hasn't really surprised me, and he clearly deserves to be in this kind of list at this moment in time. In terms of King, he's someone who found a very, very nice haul versus his ex-team in terms of Everton, a team that kind of let him down in terms of giving him opportunities to shine under Carlo Ancelotti. And And, sometimes some players are maybe mentally more ready for specific occasions, but at the same time, we have a change in manager at this moment in time. Yes, as I argued in the previous week, it's a really poor eye test to look at a team playing versus Liverpool. It just doesn't really give you enough insight into whether or not players are interesting. Whereas, we saw this week versus Everton that Watford have the capacity to score a lot of goals, and this was something that we didn't really identify in the previous structure. But maybe if King and Watford are able to score a lot of goals, then he could be the new focal point of the team, and that's why I put him as a differential. Dennis as well had a large contribution in this game, but I would still keep him in the avoid for now category because I still think that King is probably going to be that kind of main option going forwards. If you look further down this list, the only person I've dropped is St. Maximin. And I think that comes down to the fact that Wilson has come back into the side and Wilson has occupied a more central position in the team, where St. Maximin now is kind of left out on that kind of right wing position where he's not able to get involved as much and he's not fed the ball as often as he probably likes. He's someone who probably is a difference maker when he gets onto the ball, but there are going to be a lot of games in this kind of fixture run for Newcastle where he's going to be starved from the ball, and that's going to be when he's the most, I think, less interesting or the least interesting, because he is someone who is much more dynamic on the ball and less dynamic off the ball, and I have to drop him for that kind of reason. In terms of movements, in terms of other areas, I've actually collapsed the kind of list where the 7.0 to 8.1 players have all been kind of combined into one area, and I think for that reason, it makes sense to kind of level up Antonio, because I think he is a very comparable asset to someone like Jimenez in terms of someone who can deliver on a consistent basis. And we can see that Antonio has a kind of intangible factor where even if the game isn't going well or not a lot of chances are being created, he still has the threat as a goal scorer, right? As an out-and-out goal scorer, and his ability to score in a set-piece option and play was very, very nice to see this weekend, and therefore he very much justifiably deserves his rise. Yes, Antonio is arguably going to hit some very, very rough fixtures in the near future, but I have to say that he still is a fantastic asset, and I think I don't have to immediately look towards removing him from my team, right? There's still the Aston Villa game, and yes, while some of the games ahead are a lot tougher, for me, he still has a kind of slight intangible where, I might actually decide to keep him, for the long term. In terms of Wilson, I think he's heading into a much kind of rougher fixture run, but I still can't deny the kind of form he's been in, basically whenever he's not injured. And the thing is, a lot of people have taken Wilson out of their teams due to the fact that he's been injured, but as soon as he's come back, he scored 2 goals back to back, and I just can't deny that form. So for that reason, Wilson has to rise. In terms of Bamford, I've actually dropped him because I think, I'm not exactly sure whether he'll make the Norwich game, but even if he does, I think, a player coming out from a long injury, in a sense, is going to struggle a little bit. And then once we go past the Norwich game, it's actually not that interesting to hold Leeds assets, in my opinion, because the fixture run is considerably worse than when, of course, Bamford became a very interesting option several weeks ago. And that's pretty much how things are right now. I think Bamford just isn't that interesting. I can't see why he would probably be put into sides. I think a lot of people are actually looking to trim down how much budget they have in their forwards, because the forwards recently haven't been that interesting, if anything. I think what we've seen so far is that these kind of Chelsea defenders, these City defenders, even Trent, for example, have been super interesting, and those are the ones where you want to spend your kind of 7.5 or even your 6.0 kind of budget players for. And, at this point in time, it just doesn't make that much sense to go for an asset who probably is going to be playing quite often for Leeds when he actually comes back into the side, but isn't going to be as talismanic, because I think Leeds considerably have dropped in terms of form this year, and the focal point actually still for me is going to be Rafinha. In terms of the other assets in around these kind of price ranges for the forwards, I would say we have to take a step up and actually look at Vardy. This week was a very odd week where I think, I was definitely not interested in Vardy, because even though I had Ronaldo in my team and I didn't expect him to haul versus Liverpool, I didn't really equally see a haul for Vardy versus Brentford. And we are heading into a phase of the season where I think Leicester's fixtures are getting considerably harder, I would say. And yes, whilst Vardy was actually able to haul previously, we have to kind of take into account these fixtures and justifiably drop him in form, especially after a kind of 45-minute substitution versus Brentford, whatever the reason that was. And I think that has also shown the kind of emergence of Patson Daka as well in the Leicester team, and how dependable he is as an option away from Vardy. And whilst I'm not saying this is the end of Vardy, I just think that he's clearly just not a best option at this point in time. And it just speaks to the fact that a lot of these kind of top premiums just haven't been delivering as we've expected. If I move on, actually, I'd like to actually look at the keepers. And I think the only real movement around this area is me actually dropping Ramsdale. I think Arsenal's fixtures are arguably getting a little bit tougher. And not only that, but I think even though Ramsdale has been interesting as a keeper, I would actually say that both Raya and Sanchez have been equally interesting in terms of their ability to keep clean sheets in individual games, And not only that, but also their ability to actually get a lot of bonus points in games that are tough. So, for example, in this Brighton game very recently versus Man City, we saw Sanchez actually manage a 4-point haul, whereas Ramsdale only managed a 3-point haul versus an Aston Villa side who pretty much got crumpled by Arsenal. And yes, it was very unfortunate that Ramsdale actually conceded a goal, but I wouldn't say that Arsenal are the most stalwart side in terms of defense, right? When we actually compare it towards other very comparably good defensive sides like Brentford and Brighton. So for that kind of reason, I have to say that I think I would like to rank them all, in this list together as assets and keep them together. But that's really it for my cheat sheet video. A little bit of a long one this week. Or actually not that long actually, now that I'm actually looking at the video timer. But I hope you guys really enjoyed the video this week. But I'll see you guys in the next video.